Hey everyone, welcome back. I've got another meme loadout for you today. This is actually an update on that Rhino Javlok I made eons back. If you want to see that, check the card at the top right. This build has evolved to solve a couple of problems on the Rhino Javlok. There are two iterations of this build we can set up, one for camping and one for being on the move. Ironically, somehow the camping build has better KPS. Our protagonists for today? Chroma, the Master of Elements, nice meme, and a dragon only by name. And Loki, the original trickster that was once a starter frame, and generally underappreciated these days. Let's go over Javlok again real quick. As the last time I made this video, Sisters of Parvos had not yet dropped, meaning galvanized mods and weapon arcanes didn't exist yet. Also, I was nowhere near as practiced in the workings of the game, so I've definitely changed my approach in theory crafting since then. Alright, 20% crit chance. While the 2.0 crit multiplier is average, the 20% crit is dated for modern times. We're going to be using the throw build on Javlok today. This means we only get one fat hit per throw. It needs the crit because if it doesn't, we're just throwing wet noodles at them. So this crit chance is going to need some real work. The status chance is 25%. It's not piss poor, but remember, we only get one hit. And another thing, actually, let's scroll down, as we're using the charge throw stats and not the primary fire stats. They're mostly the same, save the listed charge rate, fire rate, faster reload, and somehow being silent. So this charge damage and radial on the throw versus the quick shot damage and the radial on the throw. Their base damage scaling are identical, but there are two key differences. The quick throw takes time to detonate after it hits its mark. The charge throw detonates instantly, but the charge throw also scales with magazine size. Each shot in the magazine boosts damage of the AoE by 20%, so magazine mods are actually another useful multiplicative stat to mod on a weapon. So what would the Javlok build look like? Well, this is what I settled on. Pure IPS? Oh, there's an internal bleeding mod here. Well, actually, I forgot to tell you one other thing. This throw, it has forced impact on the AoE, and it scales off of that stat too, which is a damage component affected by magazine size. So we can slash without relying on hunter munitions, and a much better ratio too instead of just 30%. The base fire rate of the Altfire is treated as 1.0, therefore we get 70% conversion of impact procs to slash. We also get to mod magazine size for a fat damage boost, tainted mag and primed magazine warp. But actually, this isn't a free bonus. In exchange, the thrown projectile completely ignores multi-shot. It doesn't even work with the multi-shot buff from Octavius Metronome, which actually does bypass and work on certain options like gunblades, conditioned projectiles, and glaives. We're basically supplementing damage with another stat. But multi-shot also gives more status procs, whereas magazine size doesn't, so this is actually a worse alternative. We want consistent crits even if slash no longer requires it to proc, so we're slotting critical delay. Reload is irrelevant on this weapon, which you'll soon see. I'm letting you know now this will be paired with a Combat Discipline Arcane Avenger set up to surpass 100% crit. If I use Point Strike instead, I would only have 50% chance, which only reaches 95 with Arcane Avenger. We will pair this with Vital Stance for that much needed crit damage. Primed Bane because we're slashing, so it double dips on the procs from internal bleeding, and a Primed Firestorm. If we're only getting one projectile, we might as well get as much boom as we can, and Primed Firestorm does. This increases the radius to 10 meters. The final slot depends on which frame you're running. Keep in mind, Galvanized Aptitude does not work on the AoE nuke, so if you're taking Loki, you can slot Insuration here. There really isn't much else you can fit, and it's the best DPS for this last slot. In contrast, for Chroma, we don't run Serration because Vex Armor counts for base damage, which would cause diminishing returns. Therefore, we're gonna slot Hammershot instead. Extra crit chance, and yay, free status, which doesn't really matter on this build. I didn't pick bladed rounds because it appears to be very finicky and I can't tell if it actually works or not, as you un-ADS once you throw, and it takes time for the projectile to reach its mark. Feel free to test yourself. We've also got Primary Merciless to source more base damage off kills. The reload speed can also be handy on the alt-fire when the magazine isn't full, besides synth bonuses. Also, there's one last interaction we skipped over. So this Javlok throw, when it contacts a surface or enemy, it instantly detonates, dealing damage in an AoE, and then it sticks there for 6 seconds unless you pick it up yourself. It also uses up all the ammo in the magazine and auto reloads over time while it's on the ground. The reload claims 0.6 seconds on the UI, but there's a delay before it starts, so if you pick this up before it's fully reloaded, congrats! You now have a partial magazine that will nerf the damage of your next throw unless you reload the rest either manually or holster reload. But if you hit an ally with this, whether a teammate or a Spectre, or more importantly, ability ally objects such as, I don't know, Loki's Decoy or Chroma's Effigy, it instantly detonates on contact, but also brings it back to your hand immediately as well, so you can immediately throw it again without having to pick it up. And it also doesn't consume ammo, so you also don't have to reload or wait to reload the weapon. This basically gives you the bonus you're missing from multi-shot by throwing multiple times rapidly instead. This massively improves our DPS with the weapon, and you bet we're going to be using this to tie into our builds. So let's move on to those. Chroma first. I'll bet this is probably the weirdest Chroma build you've ever seen. Outside of Umbral Forma, this build is pushed to its limit and I really can't make it better. It actually almost doesn't work. Prime sure-footed because with an AoE option like Javlok's Throw, this should be obvious. We need a CC ability to pull enemies over towards our effigy. It is expensive to cast and slow to cast. For both of these reasons, the Chroma setup is more suited to camping, so you don't have to worry about the logistics of your 4 as much. Therefore, I have chosen Larva. Larva lets you pull enemies to areas they aren't, while Ensnare can't and requires an enemy to be there so you can't cherry pick where you want them to be. Airburst only holds them in space temporarily. Chroma's Effigy occasionally casts a radial ragdoll CC that will yeet enemies. Its heat breath on the colors I've chosen also temporarily reduce armor for the duration of its fire spit for heat procs, which is basically the entire duration they're CC'd. It actually CCs the enemies so that even if they outlive the larva ball, they can't immediately attack either due to the ignite status, but the important part is larva holds them in place to prevent Effigy from yeeting them and lets you effectively kill them. But larva also has reduced range as Helmet, therefore we have opted to squeeze as much range as we can with the slots we have available. This is done with Overextended and Stretch, granting larva an 18.2 meter pull radius. This is nearly insufficient for the build, but it does work. To improve this further, I would recommend casting the larva slightly above ground to ensure it has best line of sight possible to pull in all enemies. As Javlok has a 10 meter AoE, you don't need the larva to pop directly beside the effigy. You probably noticed the rank 4 Stretch, and maybe even the rank 8 Equilibrium. This is because we want to run a lower ranked combat discipline to not kill ourselves with the self damage. While Chroma does have its 2 to heal, it adds another source of energy drain on the build when we can already barely manage it. It's easier to just maintain a lower health drain from the aura, although you can try using his 2 if you feel like it. This aura also lets you stack up Vex armor by just killing things, and oh boy will you be killing things. Useful because incoming damage on Steel Path can be extremely high, so trying to face tank specifically 100 damage without vitality can get pretty messy. This aura is also used to fuel Arcane Avenger as self-damage from combat discipline can proc it, which will give us the 45% flat crit we sorely need to boost Javlok above 100% crit for consistent damage. Now I was talking about high energy drain on this build. That's why we have both Streamline, Equilibrium, and also Arcane Energize. But why? Look at his pelt. 5.49 energy drain per second, and we will pretty much have this ability permanently active. This ability drains 330 energy per minute. We also have Vex Armor that costs 52.5 energy and needs to be cast twice a minute. Then we also have Larva, which will be casted once every 5 to 10 seconds for 17.5 energy. It immediately resets the duration for you to cast again if you kill everything in it. The builds end up using 550 to 600 energy or so a minute in total. And Xeneric doesn't work because, well, Effigy is a channel. If you aren't aware, this is an extremely high amount of drain, and that's assuming you don't screw up. To help this a little further, we've slotted Prime Continuity. Not only does this give us a usable 31-second duration on Vex Armor, but it also extends out the Larva CC to 9 seconds in case you have issues ramping up your damage at the start. This guarantees the effigy will never be able to yeet enemies away before you kill them. We've also restored some strength with the Umbral Intensify and energy conversion. Basically, you want to keep your Vex up at all times as well and make sure you only cast it after getting an energy orb. The difference is getting 520% base damage with 189 strength instead of 382%. For Operator Arcanes, this one is actually quite important. We're bringing Magus Elevate to give an easy reprieve against combat discipline, especially because it isn't rank 0, but also Magus Anomaly to pull enemies in, as sometimes Larva will be on cooldown or you won't have the right angle or range to cast it where you want to pull all the enemies in. Javlok can hit through walls, so even if enemies get stuck nearby, it's still worth it. This also cuts down the energy spent on Larva if you really try to spam it. Together, these arcanes are essential and what allows the Chroma build to actually work. Pet build? Panzer. Why Panzer? Because we need energy this time, and even more than the actual viral spreading. Viral quills procs and spreads between enemies easily. Any enemy hit by viral quills counts as a pet assist, since Deconstruct have a 25% chance for enemies tagged by your pet to drop a health orb when killed. Pulled enemies to you with Larva Guarantee quills will spread between them and you will kill them. Remember Equilibrium on the Chroma build? Yeah, so this is why. We'll be getting a ton of health orbs and a decent amount of energy out of it this way because Synth Fiber makes it so you're always able to pick up health orbs even at full HP. Also Synth Set Holster bonus. If your Javlok is partial magazine, say because you missed, you can just swing your melee instead of going through the full reload animation. This is the same Panzer build we'll be using for Loki later, but he doesn't need the energy support as much. However, this is your generic utility Panzer, as Tech Assault also lets it survive better, so feel free to use it as a baseline for everything. I've also brought an optional Azuma as a camping primer and single auger mod slot to at least give you back some shield gating on Chroma. Basically, you don't have to chuck this down, but when you throw your Javlok and it doesn't immediately come back, i.e. if you miss, it will pull out your secondary. Normally you use the alt fire to charge through the Javlok, so if you do this by accident on the Azuma, it will spit out the disc instead, and this means it will now apply viral stacks for 28 seconds in an AoE. Basically a useful piece of utility and functions well even when you accidentally miss the Javlok and end up deploying the Azuma due to them sharing the same alt fire button. And finally, this is your generic Vastlok stripper build for Acolytes. The important mod here is Shattering Impact, which removes base armor, because Acolytes are tanky and heat is the pure element on Javlok, which has no health or armor advantage against them. While you can kill them with dots, the initial AoE of Javlok does massive damage to Acolytes to speed up the process if they are stripped. The elementals here can be whenever, it's general purpose. Acolytes cannot be procced by viral. You could change this to something else if you're running a CO or condition build on other weapons. You could even slot heat for heat inherent proc refresh while armor stripping. It's all up to you. Showcase time? Well, you basically grab an orb and cast Vex Armor, then you find a nice hole that enables good spawns and place your effigy somewhere near the entrance, but just out of the way because it isn't invincible. While it is quite tanky and got lots of CC, the less you have to recast it, the better. You larva out to an area near the effigy and then spam Javloks at it. Occasionally fit in more Magus Anomaly spam and cast larva as needed. Keep your Vex up as it only lasts 31 seconds. You don't want it to reset, especially if it was an energy conversion boosted. Then you'll have to wait for another orb before recasting. Though keep in mind, like I said, you can stack Vex Armor pretty easily just by throwing your Javloks at your effigy to kill everything in the larva ball. You're pretty much always doing something, but this is how we can make the build work. It's kind of similar to AoE launchers, except you never have to reload and there's an inbuilt CC as a required part of the rotation. I personally think it's pretty fun. Definitely make sure you pick good rooms though, as certain ones can cause spawn density problems. For example, this spawn room I'm camping on Void. I need to be on the left side, throwing at my effigy on the right. If I camp on the right to shoot at my effigy instead, for some reason, spawns get a lot worse and it becomes problematic to keep up with life support drain. But being on the left side works wonders, and I can even regain life support if it starts dipping. Nice coding, am I right? Anyways, let's move on to that Loki build. This one, once again, is a Combat Discipline Arcane Avenger build. I mean, that isn't really a problem because you're invincible and we really need that 100% crit chance for Javlok to be consistent. Prime sure-footed for obvious reasons, but also because we're actually going to be bringing an AoE primer this time. The energy drain on this build is much more sustainable, so Arcane Energize alone is more than enough to solve our problems. We have Streamline thrown on as well, but it's really only to save mod points. If you want to go big to maximize the utility from Energize, feel free to take Prime Flow for that fat energy bank instead. We want as much range as we can reasonably fit on our grouping CC today, and Snare. Doubly so because we need to maximize the amount of duration for invisibility ease of use. So we've slotted all the range mods Overextended, Stretch, and Augur Reach. This is slightly cut back by Narrow-Minded alongside Prime Continuity. However, we still retain a 19.9 meter pull radius on Ensnare, which is adequate for this strategy to work. The duration is also 254, letting our invisibility last 30.5 seconds and is actually pretty comfortable. Finally, I've also slotted Safeguard Switch because we cannot CC the entire room. The purpose of this mod is to make our decoy invincible so the enemies don't kill it while we're DPSing. When casting Switch Teleport on our decoy, this will make them invincible for 15 seconds, which is plenty of time to DPS. I'm betting on being able to immediately cast my 3 on my 1 after it spawns before enemies kill it, which should be pretty reasonable since I CC all the enemies in the immediate vicinity with Ensnare. While for Chroma you place Effigy first and then drag the enemies to you, this time we ensnare enemies first and then cast decoy and switch TP it afterwards. Then we're free to spam our Javlok at the decoy until everything dies. This build lacks a bit of firepower, but the amount of grouping this setup allows and the freedom of being able to move around while invisible offsets it somewhat. We still have Primary Merciless on the weapon after all, and Slash bypasses armor. We also have the Bane to double dip. Just make sure you're running Serration instead of Hammershot on this build, since we're no longer on Chroma. You can bring whatever primer you want, since you're free to swap as we brought Vigorous Swap on Loki as well. This is actually to account for the lack of damage buffs, and Viral will help immensely with that. It isn't absolutely mandatory, but you may find it makes the damage more satisfying. We actually chose a really unique primer this time. This is a primer Spore Lacer. Yes, that's right, a primer Spore Lacera. Probably the first time you've seen something like this, right? It has that high crit multiplier, but the crit chance sucks. That's not what we're using the weapon for. On the other hand, the status chance is sky high. And it even has a radial of 7.8 meters with Prime Fulmination. This weapon even has a weird gimmick, how when you make a Spore Lacera with a Gibber grip, it loses so much damage that the main projectile shot drops to 0 and does nothing. Nada. That's why there's no damage for the projectile here like the normal Spore Lacera, and it only lists the radial attack damage. But that's fine because we're using it for the AoE potential. Now why Gibber, actually? Because it gives the highest fire rate, which is extremely important for an AoE primer. More fire rate directly equals more status, so if you can get that innately without having to mod for it, do it. This is your generic build. Focused around big range and as much viral as possible. Why just 2 elementals is fine? Because Galvanized CO doesn't work on Javlok, so the only status that really matters is viral. We have Radiation to turn on friendly fire, SCC utility, and disable Ancient Healer auras as needed. But now you might be wondering why we're using this instead of Epitaph. That's a good question, and it's twofold. One, because we have Pax Charge, meaning we literally never have to reload or worry about ammo on this thing, whereas in theory Epitaph could run out if you have DPS problems. That's the small one though. The big reason is this mod. This primer was actually intended for an Ivara Javlok build. Unfortunately, Ivara ended up being way too cumbersome to use with subsumed decoy and managing Invis-Arrow so that it wouldn't die while also sitting on her dash wire. It was just a mess. Even if it outdamaged both builds here, the amount of setup caused massive KPS problems. Also, it's much easier to miss a decoy from above than on ground level as the hitbox is smaller vertically. She also had massive energy problems, like Chroma, but she wanted to stay on her dash wire. Well, how do we get around that? Enter Energizing Shot, a mod that lets you shoot energy orbs to grab them back instantly with extra effect. It can also proc Arcane Energize. This let Ivara sit on her rope without ever having to come down, and would naturally regenerate energy just by priming enemies she's killing or just shooting around in general. You get back around 202 energy this way per orb if Energize procs, otherwise it's just 52. It's just really nice all-round utility because normally this does not work on AoE weapons. Being able to use this on Spore Lacera means you do not necessarily need to aim, and it's extremely easy to pick up those orbs. Also, you can actually shoot this faster than the Quickshot Epitaph. Trust me. Fiddle around a bit with Epitaph and you'll notice there is a limit to how fast you can shoot it because of the charge mechanic preventing you from shooting again immediately afterwards. Whereas Spore Lacera can shoot much faster and doesn't have this problem. It produces a ton of viral and can genuinely max out the crowd in 4 shots. 7.8 meter radius on Spore Lacer is more than enough to cover and ensnare crowd entirely. So how about those focus schools? You can also bring Zeneric if you want. Honestly, it doesn't really matter what you bring, because Chroma already has so much going on that Vazarin is hard to fit in. Naramon would be useless on it, and Zeneric wouldn't work for Chroma energy regen since Effigy is a active channel ability. But for Loki, you can really use whatever you want as energy isn't a problem. Zeneric is just the brain dead easy choice if you just want more energy for some reason. The Vastlok is being brought for the same reason as Chroma, to armor strip Acolytes so you can end them with Javlok, including the raw damage. And Snare can actually trap Acolytes, so it should be much easier to kill them than on Chroma's setup with them running around everywhere. Now the final bit, the Loki Showcase. This one is pretty simple. You ensnare enemies, you cast your decoy, you teleport swap, optional primer like I said, optional. Then you spam your Javlok at your clone. Ironically, this build has worse KPS than the Chroma one, probably purely because of a decent camping setup and Magus anomaly overcoming the stun problems that Effigy causes, but I would say this is a pretty fun use of Loki and gives another interesting purpose to his decoy. Also, the Javlok. When was the last time you saw somebody use that? Who would have thought we'd finally have a use for Chroma's Effigy beyond just a Profit Taker credit booster? Who would have thought we'd be using Decoy as part of our actual DPS kit rotation? I certainly wasn't expecting either of these at first. This was certainly a fun experiment to play around with, and I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with the results. I realize this isn't a meta-viable option, but I definitely add this to the collection of interesting weapon synergies that can work and I wasn't expecting when I first went in blind. Hope you like this updated version of the Rhino Javlok build I originally covered. If you want to check the OG video out, I've also included in the description and the pinned comment below. Tell me what you think of this one. Have you managed to find a use for Chroma's Effigy yet besides Profit Taker? If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. 79.5% of you are not subscribed. I'm trying my best to get you new information out always as soon as possible, like I've done with covering the Sisters of Parvos and Plague Star updates. Stick around if you want to see interesting memes and builds on a nearly daily basis. I'm also preparing to get you the info first once more new war info drops. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.